Hello and welcome. Welcome to St Anne's. It's good to have you here today. It's Sunday, 28th of June. Today's passage, read very well by Pete Stewart, thank you Pete, is a sombre warning. It's a warning that we all need to take seriously. And I'll introduce it with a story which I saw in the local newspaper when I was a kid and which tickled me. A masked man had gone into a local bank. He'd pointed a cucumber at the cashier. He'd said words to the effect of, "It's a shotgun, love. Put the money in the bag and no one's going to get hurt," and made off with a substantial haul. Written up in the Kidderminster Shuttle, probably in about 1982 or maybe 1983, the police tracked and caught the man in question, and he was charged with robbery, possession of an offensive weapon, and laundering stolen money. And that's the bit that causes me to remember this story. Apparently the barrister for the defence successfully argued that a cucumber was not an offensive weapon. It may have been used like an offensive weapon. The robber may have called it a shotgun, and at quick glance it might have had the appearance of a shotgun, but a cucumber is not an offensive weapon. I recall that the case was helped by the fact that the robbers stopped off at a local market to buy the cucumber en route to the bank. A trivial story from small town England, perhaps, but it tickled my 8-year-old sense of humour. Today's passage is another section of the letter from Paul to his acolyte Timothy, a young pastor who Paul was tutoring. And from what we've gathered in the letter thus far, things are a bit bleak for both of them. Chapter 1, Paul has told of his suffering. He's spoken of everyone deserting him, and he's spoken of the time he spent in chains. And he spent much of the letter thus far encouraging Timothy to be stronger and to share in Paul's suffering. Paul said he himself didn't look too good, but the power was from the Lord, not from outward appearance. He clearly tells Timothy not to have a spirit of timidity, but to fan into flame the gift of God. And this week we come to a short passage, which we're going to study in two halves. The first half tells us about a group of people and how they behave. The second half tells us who they influence and how far they will get. Look with me at the first half, chapter 3, verses 1 to 5. We're told this is set in the last days and says that there will be terrible times. These last days are taken to mean the period between Christ's ascension, that's when he returned into heaven at the end of the Gospels, and his return. So Paul and Timothy would have been in the last days, and we're in the last days now as well. What he says in this passage therefore applies both to Timothy and to us now in the same way. And the terrible times we're told about? Other Bible translations have perilous or unrestrained to describe them, the same words that would be used to describe someone who is possessed by a demon or an evil spirit. And in those terrible times, people will be terrible. Look at that list. What do you see? People who are lovers of themselves. They're lovers of money. They're boastful. They're proud. They're abusive. They're disobedient. They are even disobedient to their parents. They are ungrateful. They are unholy. They are without love. We'll come back to that one. They are unforgiving. They are slanderous. They are without self-control. They are brutal. They are not lovers of God. They are treacherous. Treacherous. Great word. Terrible trait to have. They are rash, they are conceited, they are lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God. Now, we could dig into that list in quite some detail and have a look at all of those characteristics. But the first one and the last one probably tell us most of what we need to know. These people are lovers of themselves and of themselves only. All of those nasty attributes come from that one fact. Everyone loves something, and what you love determines how you behave, which is picked up at the end of that list. These people are lovers of pleasure, rather than people who love God, which is what the Bible tells us we were created to be. And we might come to the end of that list and think, so what? What's so shocking about this? People love themselves and behave badly in sinful ways. Are we surprised? Is that not what the Bible tells us many times over? We'd be right, were it not for that awful last phrase there in verse 5. These people have a form of godliness, but deny its power. The people who are being talked about here aren't the average people who you might meet on the street or bump into at Lidl or stand in a queue within the post office. These are people who have an appearance of godliness, but they are denying its power. They're people in the church. They might even be leaders in the church. They're people who take communion. They're people who say grace before meals. These are people who appear upright and respectable and, well, godly. These people who do all these things are the ones who might hand out the communion wine or lead Bible studies Perhaps they wear a dog collar or a bishop's mitre. Perhaps one of them is speaking to you now. And what is the power of God that these people deny? That came up in a sermon about 3 weeks ago, back in chapter 1, verse 7. For God did not give us a spirit of timidity, but a spirit of power, of love, and of self-discipline. The power of God is love and self-discipline. How much of a problem is this? Well, let's remember how this chapter started. There will be terrible times. This is a terrible problem. And the imperative there at the start of the section, mark this, in verse 1, is matched with an imperative at the end, have nothing to do with these people. In verse 5, have nothing to do with people who appear to be godly, but who actually are lovers of themselves. Who do these people influence, and what will happen to them? To answer this, we need to look at the second part of the passage, verses 6 to 9. They are the kind who worm their way into homes and gain control over weak-willed women, who are loaded down with sins and swayed by all kinds of evil desires. What do these people want to do? They want to achieve control by deceitful means. The word worm is not a good one when used to describe behaviour, and it's not good here. These people are worming their way into homes. And let's not forget the early church would have met in people's homes, so this worming into homes would probably have meant worming into churches as well. Let's think about these women for a moment. Paul is referring to a subset of women, ones who are particularly vulnerable and able to be led astray. These women are typified by the fact that they are laden down with sin and swayed by all kinds of evil desires. They're the ones who make easy victims and ready prey for unscrupulous fraudsters. These women are always learning, but not able to acknowledge the truth, probably because in verse 8 we learn that these evildoers actively oppose the truth which they should be teaching. Paul speaks very well of women elsewhere in this letter. Remember how he spoke of the sincere faith of Eunice and Lois in chapter 1? And if you flick forward, you can see he has particular words of praise for other women in his closing comments at the end of chapter 4. When he speaks of weak-willed women here, he's talking about particular individuals, not women as a whole. And how much do these evil men oppose the truth? They are compared to Jannes and Jambres, who featured, but not by name, in the story of the plagues in Exodus. They are the two sorcerers who were summoned by Pharaoh to show up Moses and Aaron's miracles as not being of God. You may remember in Exodus 7, Aaron was instructed to throw his staff to the ground and it became a snake. But Jannes and Jambres also threw down a scarf, and it did the same. Moses and Aaron turned the river Nile into blood, but we're told that the Egyptian magicians did the same thing by their secret arts. Jannes and Jambres opposed Moses in the way that these evil men in 2 Timothy opposed the work of Timothy and Paul, the work of the gospel. How far do they get in this endeavour? Well, that's the reassuring thing about this passage. In Exodus, we're told that Jannes and Jambres matched Moses and Aaron in the staff into snake miracle. They matched them in turning water into blood, and they also matched them in making frogs appear. But they couldn't get any further than that. In Exodus 8, Moses and Aaron caused gnats to appear from the dust, and this couldn't be matched by the Egyptian magicians, exposing the fact that their abilities were limited. In the same way, Paul is quite clear at the end of verse 9 in this week's passage that the folly of these evil men will be exposed to everyone. We don't know when, we don't know how, but it's clear that these evil men will sooner or later come unstuck, just as the Egyptian magicians did. And for that, we can give great thanks. This letter was written to Timothy in the last days. We're also in the last days, so what can we learn from this section of it? I think, first of all, we need to look at ourselves. If you're in church and you have the outward appearance of godliness, but know that things are seriously amiss, then do something about it. No one's perfect. We're all plagued by sin, but the mark of a true Christian is a desire to please God and a reliance on the death of Christ to save them from that sin. And the evil men in this passage don't fit that description. If you're reading this and thinking that you could be one of those evil men, then don't brush it off. But I think this scenario is unlikely. Evil men such as these fundamentally oppose the truth, and they're unlikely to be swayed by an instruction like this. Perhaps the bigger lesson we need to learn from this passage is that we're being warned to be discerning. We'd like to think we can spot a false teacher a mile off. We know our Bibles. We know sound teaching when we hear it, and we'd know how to give a wrong 'un a bit of a heave-ho as soon as he opened his mouth. but it's not that simple. False teachers don't walk around in t-shirts which say, "I am a false teacher," written on them. No person in church leadership would ever say they are against the work of the gospel. They wouldn't get to such a position if they said such a thing. False teachers are often charming, very pleasant to spend time with. They're frequently nice people who are very good at taking other people in, people who are easily deceived, like these weak-willed women at this passage. False teachers can be the nicest, but the most dangerous people you will ever meet. So we can't spot false teachers by their appearance. They appear to be godly. How do we spot them? The answer to this is back in verse 5. That false appearance of godliness is matched with a denial of godly power. And the power they are denying is of love and of self-control. And if we look at the list at the beginning of the reading, that list of very unattractive character traits, they all fit that description. They are all traits of someone who has no love for anything other than themselves and no self-control in any way. Paul has spent much of the letter thus far telling about his suffering and encouraging Timothy to share in that suffering. Today he is warning of evildoers who are self-centered and seem to avoid suffering at all costs. You can recognize them as they might look good, but the pattern of their ministry is not one of accepting the hardship of the gospel. He is holding up those who are in it for themselves and what they can get out of it, and showing it as being a different perspective to those which he, Paul, considers important. Those who are part of the Bible study group might remember something similar from this week's study in 1 Corinthians chapter 2, when Paul, the same guy who wrote this letter, said the following: "When I came to you, I did not come with eloquence or human wisdom, as I proclaimed to you the testimony about God. For I resolved to know nothing while I was with you except Jesus Christ and him crucified. I came to you in weakness, with great fear and trembling. My message and my preaching were not with wise and persuasive words, but with a demonstration of the Spirit's power, so that your faith might not rest on human wisdom, but on God's power." If we're to spot false teachers from amongst ourselves, then we need to look at our teachers closely. Do you remember the opening true story about the bank robber with the cucumber? The clerk behind the counter saw something that had the vague appearance of a shotgun. She was told it was a shotgun, and she handed the money over. If she'd looked more closely, she would have seen that she was being fooled, and the story would have had a very different ending. The false teachers in this passage are like that cucumber. They might look persuasive at a quick glance, but they won't stand up to close scrutiny. I'll admit I'm oversimplifying it all a little bit here. You don't need to look too closely to see the difference between a cucumber and a shotgun, whereas some false teachers are very persuasive indeed. But the point is well made. We need to carefully examine things to see whether they are real or whether they are false. And we can do that by looking at the way that our church leaders behave. Is your small group leader self-centered, or do they behave in a way that shows they are willing to suffer for the gospel? Who does your pastor or vicar really love? Do you see in them a willingness to put the gospel message before their own desires? Does your bishop hold tightly to biblical teaching, even if it means being unpopular in the world's eyes and frowned upon by society? This message is divisive and potentially very offensive, but the gospel is often offensive, and we are in possession of an offensive message. We need to check all those who teach us. Does the message preached and taught in your church have real power? By your church, I mean here at St. Anne's, or your home church if you're visiting from somewhere else. Richard, Alex, me, PCC members, leaders of your small group, you should be looking at them all and the way they behave and be asking these questions of them on a regular basis. Do your church leaders have the power of God, as shown in their love and self-discipline, or are they relentlessly selfish and self-centered? Are we dealing with the power of a shotgun, or are we dealing with the power of a cucumber? And this passage says that if we have doubts about someone, then we should have nothing to do with them. In summary, we, all Christians need to take great care not to be taken in by teaching that is not of God, as we live in terrible times. This passage has been a somber and serious warning message. It needs to be taken seriously. Let's pray together. Heavenly Father, we take this warning seriously. May we be discerning about what we are taught. May we take care to check our teachers and leaders carefully, that they may be people of you, not people of self-love. May we be sharp to spot teaching that is not of you when we hear it. and may we have nothing to do with people who are responsible for such teaching. Amen.